Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for tonight's session of the Communist Culture Club. Tonight, we are looking at a very interesting session, I believe, by Malcolm Millais, who's introducing a session on people, architecture, urbanism, and politicians.
Oh, hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. I'm not going to go into any depth into these subjects that I've got on my first slide because the whole thing's very complicated. So I'm just trying to sort of sketch the whole thing in and try and make some connections that maybe most people haven't made. So on my first screen, I've got people, and I'm going to look at people quickly from an anthropological point of view. And then I'm going to look at architecture and see how modernism has affected it. This is obviously the elephant in the room. And then I won't do much about urbanism because it's such a big subject. I'll just mention it in passing. And then I'm going to have a quick look at how politicians deal with architecture. So this thing on the bottom left shows us as we came from great apes about 6 million years ago. Some creature up here decided to become men and chimpanzees. The difference is that these people walked upright and these people climbed trees. So this shows how humans came from Africa and they became various sorts of humans. These were all upright walking apes, and eventually only Homo sapiens were left, which is us. And as you can see, it spread all over the world. And this is how they spread. They came out of Africa. This is quite often called out of Africa, and it's usually thought to be about 70,000 years ago. And they went to the rest of Africa, came up into Europe, went up through Asia, down through America, and to the Pacific Islands. So here are a few important dates, and I put the percentage of life on Earth. So the key discovery was the control of fire, and this is thought to have happened about 1 million years ago with upright apes, which weren't us. The first humans that thought to have appeared this is sort of, everybody says, oh, it's about 200,000, 300,000 years ago. So that's basically how long we've been on this planet as modern humans. And as you can see, agriculture starts only 12,000 years ago, only 5% of the time we were here. Then the oldest known building is 9,000 years ago, copper smelting 7,500 years ago, writing only appears 3,500 years ago. The Iron Age begins 1.2 thousand years ago. The modern age, which I count from the Industrial Revolution, is only 250 years ago. And as you can see, it's only 0.1% of our existence on Earth. And modern architecture, I call it, appears in 1911, which is a very small percentage of our time on Earth. So we spent nearly all the time on Earth as hunter-gatherers. And as anthropologists have pointed out, this really means that when we were born, we expected to be hunter-gatherers. So I've just done this diagram to show what little time we spent as non-hunter-gatherers. So this is all hunter-gatherers, and this is non-hunter-gatherers. And this is a diagram showing 4,000 years ago how the various sorts of society were spread over the world, from hunter-gatherers, yellow, nomadic pastoralists, simple farming societies, complex farming societies, and state societies. So as you can see, there's I can't see the whole screen here. I've got something on top of it. I'm sorry. So as you can see, yellow, which is the hunter-gatherers, 4,000 years ago, is still a large part of the world. And of course, all these societies still exist, though of course hunter-gatherers are very much reduced. Oops. So some common features of hunter-gatherers, and some are still with us today. So we smile and cry, we cry when we're sad, Shoutmery Cross. Lack of leaders, interesting. Gender equality, interesting. Most activities carried out in groups, interesting. And we were capable of ideas of saying what you're going to do tomorrow, yesterday, which of course, when they tried to teach chimpanzees to speak, in inverted commas, they never ask questions and they have no idea about tomorrow. So the egalitarian hierarchical societies of hunter-gatherer groups has often been called primitive communism. And in fact, somebody in the audience no doubt knows more about it than me, but Marx and Engels were quite interested in anthropology and early humans because German anthropologists, I think about their time, were the sort of leading anthropologists in the world. So these are some things that are common in almost all societies. They're called cultural universals. Cultural universals were a concept often attributed to an American anthropologist called Donald E. Brown, who put the question the other way around. Instead of saying, finding a new group of people that hadn't been found before, saying, how different are they? He asked how the same they were. And so, if you can see in this list, there were affection was expressed, right and wrong was known about. We'll talk about copulation, I think. People admired generosity. They had proverbs and sayings, toys. They had ornamented their body. They decorated things, and they made tools. I can't see. I'm sorry, I can't see the top of my screen. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. So here are some buildings. I don't get rid of this. I'm sorry, I'm just being a bit. I've got a bar across the top of my slide, so I can't see the whole of it. So as far as architecture is concerned and building, I don't make any big distinction between them here. I mean, you can write endlessly about the difference. But what I've done here is I've called these sort of buildings formal buildings because they're very expensive and took years to build and had very highly trained craftspeople. And this thing on the right, I call informal buildings. And of course, it's not a very strict division, but I'm sure you understand what I mean. Okay, so I now jump to back-to-back houses rather oddly. And here are some back-to-back houses. And here is a plan, which you can see the houses back-to-back. And this was their shared area they had with toilets and washrooms. And of course, this is the lowest quality of housing that existed in, say, Victorian times, which were built as cheaply as possible to house, as I'm sure you all know, rural workers going to cities to try and earn some money and being exploited, of course. Okay, so here's the opposite end of a house. This is a country house built for the rich elite, and large numbers of people worked in here. And apparently it was quite an important source of employment in rural communities. Okay, well, what I'd like to point out is when we're looking at these two extremes of housing, as far as I can see, most people say, well, they both look like houses. They both have an entrance, which you can see here. This one's obviously grander than this one, but they both have an entrance. They both have windows set in exterior walls, and they both have pitched roofs. So I put this in, I'm not really quite sure why, but this is a sort of picture from back-to-back housing, which sort of purports to show a sort of vibrant street life. I mean, how vibrant it was, I don't know. And of course, many of you will know this sort of seminal book called Kinship in East London was written. I had to have the publishing date here. But both these people went on to very long and successful careers as sociologists. And okay, so now we get to the elephant. So the word modernism refers to reactions to late 19th century life in Europe, which used new imagery, materials and techniques, and it's encapsulated by poet Ezra Pound's demand to make it new. Everything had to be new and different. Now, what's interesting is modernism deliberately excluded the vast majority of the population, as the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset pointed out, saying modern art has the masses against it, and this will always be so since it's unpopular in essence. And if modernism applied to art is deemed to be unpopular in general, so it is when it comes to architecture, modern architecture. Because as modern architect Bernard Gibbard noted in a book he wrote, in the first place, ordinary people didn't like modern architecture very much. And with familiarity, they seemed to like it less and less. Now, one of the important things about modernism is it had to be shocking. I mean, and then, because what shocks you in the first place, you soon get used to it. So when Robert Hughes, well-known art critic and art historian, wrote, well, he did it, first of all, he did an 8-part TV series in 1980, and it became a book, and it was called The Shock of the New, Shock. And this thing on the right, which is fairly disgusting, is something called extreme performance art. And I don't know how you get to see one of these or go to one of these, but the artist or the art object is sort of tied to this rack here, and the audience are invited to do things to him, which might include cutting his skin, as far as I can tell. So it's still, shocking is still part of modernism, so I don't go to these things. The first modern building on the left is the Vegas factory, and it's often considered the first modern building. If you get books on the history of modern architecture, it nearly always shows this as the first building. And it's attributed to Walter Gropius. However, he didn't design the factory. It was designed by a man called Edward Werner, who was a specialist in factory design. And all that Gropius did was to cover the whole thing with glass and make the roof flat, as you can see on the left. The owner of this company was a man called Karl Benscheit. Excuse my German. And he was very go ahead, and he wanted his new factory to look modern. And it was behind a very busy commuter line. So this is why he got Gropius. I mean, what Benscheit thought was modern, I don't know. He'd just come back from America. I think he'd seen big industrial sheds there or something. Anyway, this was, and one of the things that's interesting, this is quite a rare photograph of it, because you can see these shop awnings on the side, and they had to be added later because the people inside the factory couldn't see what they were doing because of the glare, and it got too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter, and the usual problems of trying to live in a greenhouse. And of course, that didn't stop Gropius. So on the right, you see the building that he built for the Bauhaus, which I can't remember the date, 1921 or 2. And the local people nicknamed it the Aquarium. Okay, it's a bit hard to go in a sort of logical order. So I've suddenly sprung Le Corbusier onto you. Le Corbusier was one of the famous modern architects. It wasn't his real name, of course. He changed it to Le Corbusier in the 1920s. And in 1923, he published what he called his 5 points of modern architecture. So your building had to be held up on a grid of columns, which he called for some reason pilotis. And this allowed, because it was a concrete structure, it's allowed you to have a free design of the floor plans and free design of the facade. So you could have these long horizontal windows, and it had a flat roof. And these became almost commandments for architects working after the Second World War. And if you Google buildings looking like this, the Villa Savoy, I call Savoy, I call it. You'll get dozens of buildings looking like this. Of course, the building itself didn't suit Mr. and Mrs. Savoy very much, and they constantly wrote letters to Le Corbusier saying, please make my building habitable. Let's see the top of my car. So as modern architecture had a small following in the 20s, three names emerged from all the people doing it, and that was Walter Gropius, I've already mentioned, new person Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, also German, and Le Corbusier, who originally was Swiss, but became French, and his real name was Charles-Édouard Jeanneret Gris. And they wanted to use what they thought were new materials for buildings called concrete, steel, and glass. And they wanted to have undecorated, flat roof, box-like buildings. So here's a building by Le Corbusier, and here's a building by Mies van der Rohe. And it should be noted that all three were tolerant of Nazism when it arrived, and they were quite happy to accommodate fascism if required. So I've done this rather provocative slide showing the three main people here. I mean, Mies van der Rohe, I suppose, well, Le Corbusier was very keen on fascism, and when the war broke out, he rushed to Vichy trying to get a job with them. And he wrote to his mother, saying he hoped Hitler would win the war because then everything would be better. Mies was sort of, both Mies and Gropius stayed in Germany after Hitler took power, and they both produced schemes with flags with swastikas on them in the hope that the Nazis would give them work. Unfortunately for both of them, Hitler, who was quite knowledgeable about architecture as it happened, hated modern architecture, and so their careers as architects in the Third Reich wasn't looking very rosy. But in fact, Mies van der Rohe swore allegiance to Hitler, and he used to sign his letters Heil Hitler. And in fact, both Gropius and Mies van der Rohe kept their German nationality until 1944. And the man on the right, my right anyway, I call the enabler, and this is a man called Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson has been described as an out-and-out Nazi because before the Second World War, he used to go to summer schools in Germany, and he was immensely rich thanks to parental gifts, and he formed his own Nazi party in America called the Grey Shirts, and he even had an emblem and drove his car about with why he was called the enabler. I'll come on to in just a minute. Now, Le Corbusier had a plan of how to reorganize Paris, and this was called Le Plan Voisin, and that would require a very big structure in Paris. And this was the new area for 3 million people, and it had 18 cross-shaped skyscrapers, each 60 stories high. So this was his vision of how things should be. Now, after the Second War, the people I just talked about before didn't really have a lot of work in the 20s and 30s. But when the Second World War came, or finished rather, the previous allies, the Americans and the Soviet Union, became enemies, as we all know, and that Cold War started, and there was also a cultural Cold War. And of course, the Soviets could say, well, look what we've got, Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky and the Bolshoi Ballet and all these things. And what has the US got? Hollywood films, household gadgets, chewing gum. But then it was discovered they had something that the Soviet bloc didn't have. They had modernism and modern paintings. And this was, so what they decided, when I say they, it was a very small group of people, mainly Nelson Rockefeller, Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson had used his money to create a Department of Architecture in the Museum of Modern Art. And he was very central in promoting modern art and modern architecture especially in Europe and in Germany. And the CIA were involved. So I found this in a book showing these sort of CIA men. Because the reason the CIA were involved was because if Congress or members of Congress discovered that the American government spending millions of pounds sending things like this to Europe, which they all considered to be complete rubbish, there would be a great fuss. So it was kept from them. Okay, so before the war, few architects thought that modernism was the way forward, in spite of its. A few architects did think it was the way forward, in spite of its obvious shortcomings, and they formed rebellious groups in pre-war schools of architecture. And what they did is they gradually got onto committees of the Royal Institute of British Architects, which is the controlling body for architecture in Britain, and they got onto committees by saying, yes, I'll be on the committee. And so by the time the Second War was over, they were sort of in charge. And these are extracts from a book called Architecture, Art or Profession. And it says, so this is about the 1958 Oxford Conference, which was very important, because the idea of the conference was hatched by the Board of Architectural Education, which was made up of the modernists who take control. And what they decided at this conference was that architects who previously had learned to be architects by going to work for an experienced architect now had to go to university. And they checked the universities were teaching modern architecture, and if they weren't, they got their accreditation taken from them. So people were sent to schools of architecture. And what happened in these schools of architecture, I don't have time to go into the details of this, is they became sort of indoctrination centers. And those who qualified became a sect. And this very interesting man, who was an architect, German-American, Peter Blake, he wrote in 1974 about architects, a religion as irrational as all others. The members of the sect, stress that, treat their critics with patient condescension. This building was the most influential building built after the Second World War. It was designed by our friend Le Corbusier, and it's usually called Les Unités. It's built near Marseille, and it was supposed to be, well, in fact, it translates as the large standard housing unit. And if you remember the plan he had for Paris, well, Corbusier's new plan was to cover the whole world with large standard housing units, and they were to be isolated in parkland. This was the idea of towers in the park. And this was supposed to be built in 1 year because it was a prototype and it would show everybody how good it was. Unfortunately, due to the incompetence of the design team, basically, it took nearly 5 years to build, and no final cost was ever given. You don't know how much it cost. However, with the modernists now in control in Britain, and I think in many other places, but certainly in Britain, they took on a large demolition of what was left after the Luftwaffe had done their bombing. And this was called slum clearance. And so large areas of cities like Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Plymouth were just razed to the ground. And so those people who were not happily chatting to each other in their back-to-backs were suddenly displaced and sent all over the place. And as you can see, in the background are these towers, which were the great idea of Corbusier. So all the people living in these houses here are now living in these houses here. Okay, so you would initially, of course, the people in the back-to-back houses were quite pleased because they had amazing things like running water and working toilets and their own bathroom and all sorts of things which were unimaginable in the back-to-back situation. But unfortunately, as I suppose we all know, these tower blocks just didn't work for a number of reasons. Books have been written about it. So having built enormous blocks like this, unbelievably, they then got blown up by the 100. I mean, it was an extraordinary failure of modern architecture. I mean, you think all the money and effort going into build, I don't know, others all over the place, and then they were blown up. Many of them were. Okay, here's just a few books about the failings of modern architecture, and this one here has been the best-selling. It's worth reading still, Tom. And this man here on the right is Hellman, who did cartoons about architecture and not generally seen not by the general public because they only appear in architectural magazines. But his career, he was one of the young people protesting about traditional architecture and wanting modern architecture as a student. And suddenly he saw the light and turned around. So here's a couple of his cartoons. This is one I like very much, the man walking into a glass plate window. And if you Google something like injuries due to plate glass, you'll get endless photographs of people with their faces bashed in. Now, this is another cartoon by him. He's done this perfect, lovely building, and suddenly he's put their curtains in there, and it's ruined it. Now, the reason I show this is because below, this is actually a building near where I live, which you can see is nearly all glass. And one of the people who bought the flats actually did this and actually got a letter from the architect saying, well, I don't know what it actually said, but it said, please take your curtains down, but he didn't. So I can't read the whole. So in spite of sorry about this, part of my screens so I can't read the top thing on my screen. So what the people in schools of architecture learned was the importance of presentation and being creative. And on leaving schools of architecture, immediate aims to work for what have been called starchitects. These are people who become stars in the world of architecture. they would work 24 hours a day for nothing at all, hoping that eventually they would still be alive after several years and leave, and they could write on their CVs that I worked 4 years for this famous architect. Now, they produced basically three versions of modern architecture. One was the perfect glass box, which we've already talked about a little bit. This is what I call the wonky box. I mean, I don't know what on earth this building is. It's designed by German architects, Coop Himmelbrau. Most of their buildings look like this, and what the building is, I've no idea. And then the third thing is called the swirly thing. And you can see quite a lot of these as well. This is actually I think it's an opera house. Yeah, I think so. This is about all I'm going to say about urbanism. Urbanism and the non-place. I mean, urbanism is not easy to define really. I mean, it can mean the design of whole towns, for instance, the new towns, which were the 50s. Here's Harlow being built, town I know quite well. And of course, this is also urbanism, where somebody had a factory that he didn't want, and they knocked it down. And so a new word was coined by a French anthropologist, I think he was, to describe a place that we don't live in which we are just passing through, just being annoyed slightly. And he called it a non-place. And we can now think of non-places, having got the idea of a non-place. So we think of shopping centres, supermarkets, airports, railway stations, theme parks, car parks, and so on. So a place has a history, it's unique, recognisable, and people might feel at home there. So on the left is Portofino in the 50s, when it was a fishing village. And by some extraordinary event, I had to go there when I was 16, and I thought I'd sort of gone to heaven, but I hadn't. Although I suppose they thought they had either. And so here we have the brand new baggage reclaim hall, which is sort of, you get the idea of the non-place. So the reason that people are ruining places like Barcelona, Rome, Venice, Bruges, I don't know, is because they want to go somewhere to be at home. And so by mass tourism, they're actually turning places that were unique into a sort of non-places. It's sad, really. And also, if you go to towns all over the place, you can see a little arrow saying historic centre. So that's where you head for, so you can feel at home. Okay, I want to introduce an idea called hierarchical complexity. It comes from something called information science, subject I know nothing about at all. But the idea is quite easy to grasp, I think, and I like to use a tree to explain it. So anybody looking at a tree can understand it has a hierarchy. I mean, we've got a trunk, and we've got a smaller trunk, and we've got a thick branch and thinner branches and little branches and twigs, and in the summer they would have leaves. And we also know by looking at a leaf or a twig or the bark or any part of a tree, it's actually very complicated. The closer you get, the more complicated it gets. So it has these two qualities. One is of being very complicated, and the other being that it's understandable on a sort of broad vision. On the right, I've put some modernist sculpture has made a tree out of neon tubes. And as you can see, even though it's got vaguely the shape of the real tree on the left, it's got nothing of the quality of the real tree. None at all. It's just sort of, I mean, no interest at all, I would say. Okay, well, quite a lot of books were written criticizing architecture. Some people decided they'd actually do something about it because they could. And somebody I call Charles Windsor, and is better known most people as King Charles III. That's probably, as you all know, he made a speech in 1948 to the RIBA. You can get it on the internet, and I do recommend you read it. I don't think he wrote it himself, but it's actually quite an extraordinary speech. And it was in this speech that he used the expression like a carbuncle on the face of a much loved friend. So this idea of architecture being a carbuncle came about and has been used quite a lot since. And then, because he's not a very poor person, on a large area of land he owned in Dorset, he got people who didn't do modern architecture to build something called Poundbury. Now, most architects hate Poundbury, and when you say Poundbury, they go sort of foam at the mouth. But if you go there, I went there once, and what's interesting about Poundbury, it has social housing, affordable housing, and very expensive housing, and it's all next to each other. And when I went there was two ladies talking to each other, and I asked them if they lived there, and they said yes. And did they like it? Yes. And it turned out one was living in social housing next door to one who had been living in one of the most expensive parts of Britain, in Dorset, before she moved to Poundbury. So, an alternative, and this is an American equivalent. In America, an architect called Andres Duani instituted something called the new urbanism. Now, I don't know why, but in November 2018, the government set up something called the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, okay, which in 2020 produced a report called Living with Beauty, which you can get as a download, and I recommend it. I mean, it's quite interesting. And it had 45 propositions that it suggested should be incorporated in any new building. And the first one was ask for beauty. I mean, you won't find the word beauty in any book in modern architecture that I know of. And their third proposition was say no to ugliness. Now, the commission was headed by Roger Scruton, the bête noire of the left, because as most people know about him, he was fairly right-wing and presented himself as a very right-wing character. But interestingly, he came from a very working-class family, and his father said, I mean, Roger Scruton, whatever you think about him, is very clever, was a very clever person. He died, of course. And he got a scholarship to Cambridge and a double first and all those things that are almost impossible to do. And his father said, if you go to Cambridge, I'm never going to speak to you again. And whether he actually never spoke to him again, I don't know. But it's quite interesting that Scruton came out of such a working class background. Now, whether this was a right-wing document or a left-wing document, it's hard to say. Scruton obviously was a right-wing person, but I don't know the actual. There's a list of people in this document. There's a list of people who are on the committee, and I don't know what wing they belong to. But when the document came out, it was accepted by the Conservative government at the time, and that Minister of Housing was somebody we all know called Jenrick, and he actually accepted all these propositions. And furthermore, he set up an office called the Office for Place, which was supposed to implement these propositions into the British planning system and all the rest of it. Well, I checked on it just before I did this talk, and it's just been closed by Starmer's government. On what basis, I don't know. Now, going back to what people actually see, something called eye tracking, which has been subject to research since 1980, because people, especially people studying the brain, wanted to know what people actually did with their eyes when they looked at things. And it's all been computerized. And so now, if you go and look at something with certain equipment, they can tell exactly what you're looking at. And of course, the vital part is the first 3 to 5 seconds when your brain hasn't engaged, maybe, and you're looking instinctively. And this building you're looking at is a prize-winning architectural building. Sorry, a prize-winning building. This is City Hall of Boston in America, and these are various people looking at it, and these green spots is where they look in this crucial early bit. And as you can see, they don't really look at the building. They sort of try and find something else of interest, which isn't really the building. And this eye tracking has been used for people looking at hundreds of buildings, and there's whole papers and even books you can read about it. And people always instinctively look away from what people generally call modern architecture. Their first instinct is to look at people or trees or clouds or anything but the building. Okay, so there are two people who are perhaps quite prominent in attempts to make people think there could be things other than modern architecture. And they're like Scruton. I don't know what their politics are, funnily enough. I mean, I know this man here. I asked him and he said, I'm not political. What that means, I don't know. They're both very scientifically based. They both got double first in maths and physics and stuff. And so they've got more brains than most of us put together. Now, Alexander, who again, like the other person I mentioned, it was originally German and came to England, and then, like Peter Blake, he went on to America, where he became a professor of architecture at a very early age at the University of Berkeley in Berkeley, am I supposed to say, in California. And he produced this very strange book here, The Pattern Language. It's still in print, and it goes through all sorts of patterns of how buildings meet the pavement and so on. And this is his pattern 239, and he's talking about small panes in windows. And says here, when plate glass windows became possible, people thought they would put us more directly in touch with nature. In fact, they do the opposite. So a pattern language has been described as thoroughly subversive and forward-looking, rather than, I mean, if you're supporting modern architecture, you look at it, oh, this is fashion stuff, not interesting, but it's still in print. The other man is Nikos Salingaris, and he's written more papers than I know. But he's a very, very clever man. He does a lot of work on fractals, on how people see things, on patterns and what work and doesn't work. And so this book here, which is it's a difficult read, but it's really worth it in my opinion. And it's called A Theory of Architecture. And it's the only book I've ever come across which actually has a theory. This is some bits here, architects believe this is criminal and degenerate and fascist, etc. And this is morally superior and progressive and new. So nearly at the end, these are Whitehall buildings from the 17th, 18th, 19th century, which those of you who live in London or been to London might be familiar, but anyway, you've seen buildings like this in your own city, I'm quite sure. Well, in 1964, Harold Wilson became the Prime Minister of England, as you might know. Well, I'm sure you know. And lo and behold, he discovered that it was an architectural scheme quite advanced, which meant you're going to knock down nearly all of Westminster. Those of you who know this area well, I happen to, but maybe you don't. This is Westminster Abbey. This is something called Central Hall, and everything else has gone. All these Whitehall offices, etc., all knocked down. Everything knocked down behind the Central Hall, and all replaced with sort of concrete ziggurat buildings. Now, this is a model of the scheme, and this is where you're looking at, for those of you who know the area. So you've got Houses of Parliament behind you, that's not going to be knocked down. Westminster Abbey, not going to be knocked down. Central Hall knocked down, and then everything else goes and is replaced by all these things. Okay, so this is what Harold Wilson inherited, and it was designed by a man called Leslie Martin, who later became Sir Leslie Martin, and he was a very important architect for the architects. So his cabinet supported this inherited scheme. I don't know why, I haven't seen the minutes of the meeting. And they were eager that the demolition could start as soon as possible. There's books written about this, because they were aware that there was a growing conservation movement. We're talking about 1963, which is quite a long time ago now. And they would oppose the knocking down of all these buildings, something that was and still is, I suppose, quintessential to London's architecture. And the reason that the Wilson government wanted to press ahead was to present the government with a fait accompli, so nobody could object. But luckily, they didn't have the money to knock it down, so didn't get knocked down, and Leslie Martin's scheme was never built. Okay, well, do you think that Harold Wilson liked this scheme because he loved modern architecture? Not really, because this is where he lived. This is actually in Hampstead Garden suburb, those who know it. This was his house. And this is where he didn't live. This is called the Schroeder House, and it was designed by 1924 and built in Utrecht. And as you can see, it's got buildings like this next to it. I don't know if that was built before those or those were built before that. But anyway, they didn't knock those down and built those. And so Harold Wilson didn't live in one of those. And I like these photographs because you can get lots of these photographs of all sorts of governments. And what you see here is Harold Wilson's cabinet. And what's interesting about it, and this is his official photograph of his cabinet presenting his cabinet to the world, and this is the official photograph that everybody should see. And what you'll notice is there's nothing modern about this setting at all. There's no modern paintings, no modern mirrors, no modern wallpaper, no modern carpet, no modern anything. And if you go to American presidents or any of these, almost everybody, you'll get the same picture. And the point here is that if Harold Wilson was mad about modernism, he was a powerful man. He could have said, I don't want all this stuff, take it away. I want a modern setting for my modern cabinet, and we all got to sit with modern paintings behind us. But he didn't do that because he wasn't interested in modernism at all. That's what architects did. Now, so we come to this strange question of, is the left-wing architecture or is the right-wing architecture, and what could it possibly mean? I mean, there are essays written about it, which you can access on the internet if you want. But it's hard, I find it hard to see how you can look at a building and say it's left or right wing. I mean, it's very difficult. So I've just used this sort of rather superficial illustration. I got my country house back again. So this country house was owned by a venture capitalist and updated. It had inside cinemas and swimming pools and exercise rooms and all the rest of it. You might say, well, that's obviously right-wing architecture. However, if the country house had been donated to a charity to provide caring environment for people who suffered physical or mental violence or some other such thing, you might say, well, that's a sort of pretty much left-wing building. So here are 3 books. The one on the left is extremely well known, is still in print. And this is about architecture that was built without, as it says, without architects. These are people building amazing things all over the world. And so I can't read the top thing. So does the architectural profession currently configured meet people's needs? Question. Why are the words beauty, charming, magical taboo for modern architects? Why do tourist books never show pictures of anything built after World War II? I've checked. And why are Venice, Rome, and Barcelona, as I already mentioned, being turned into non-place by tourists? Okay, this is last but one slide nearly. The reason I put this one in is because this, for me, absolutely god-awful building was built by a star architect in Los Angeles. And what's interesting is on an architectural website, and there are many of these, of course, which are usually praising of modern architecture, it's actually very critical of this building. And so it comes across as a bizarre panopticon, which was, of course, the prison system where you could look down all the corridors. So why they use that term, I don't know. Anyway, it glowers at everything around it. Steel ribbons with cementous coatings are splayed across the thin facade, creating a clash of geometries, and its hulking presence looms over the manufacturing district low buildings. So I don't know whether it's something starting, but so this is basically the summary of what I've been trying to say. So we're all programmed to be hunter-gatherers. Most of the world's population is going to live in urban areas by 2050. We're all affected by our built environment, consciously or unconsciously, even if you say, no, it doesn't affect me. In fact, it does, and it's been measurable, especially by people, rates of recovery from standard operations in hospitals where they're in different environments, and there's a marked difference in people being in friendly environments. Nearly finished. A modernism applied to architecture does not produce humane buildings, and people and politicians should be more interested in this. Urban needs to accept this is something I didn't talk about. We need to humanize the role of cars, and the whole subject is extremely political. And this is my final slide showing how it is nowadays. So there's 3 groups: architects who design for themselves and their magazines and awards, and they give designs to politicians. The politicians give them commissions. The politicians are the ruling elite, and their main concern is power and progress of their careers. And in between, we've got the people who don't commission buildings, aren't consulted. they say they have no interest or they don't understand it, and so they're just given what they get. How do I end the slideshow? Do I just end PowerPoint?
Yeah, that's the one. Or there should be a little red button on the top of your screen. Stop share. That's
my God.
Thank you very much, comrades. If anybody would like to make a contribution or ask a question, please click raise hand. Now, Malcolm, thank you for preparing an opening. I hope you don't take offense if I say I disagree profoundly with some of the things you've been saying. But you know, we're okay. We're hosting debate here.
No, you can go on, have a go, because I can tell you, you're not going to win.
I'm not looking to win. I'm not looking.
No, I know, but I mean,
for example,
it's all been gone over and over and over and over, and
you know, I think, for example, beauty, you know, is in the eye of the beholder. For example, you showed. Let me say something quickly, comrade. You showed a building of Zaha Hadid, for example, Iraqi architect. You know, the one with the big wave.
Yeah.
Fantastic. It's a fantastic piece of architecture. I see it and my heart opens up how somebody could conceive of something like this and build it, and it has a use. It's a cultural center in Baku. I love it, you know. You hate it, fair enough. But you know, I think it's very much beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And then, you know, coming to Bauhaus, I was going to ask you about Bauhaus and avant-garde. We had a session a couple of weeks ago about avant-garde, which started as a movement in Russia, inspired by the Russian Revolution. You know, bringing up new ideas, concepts into communal living, for example.
Narcofin, yes. Let's talk about Narcofin.
And they had these ideas that people, you know, form follows function. And that, for example, people should live, as you said, you know, communally together. We should live together in, you know, it makes no sense for everybody to have their own, you know, bath place or kitchen, etc. But that we do things communally. And I think that was quite an interesting and you know, new idea to allow people in the you know, in the subsequent history of the Russian Revolution, etc. to move together. It didn't work out like that, obviously, but the spirit was very democratic and very positive and going forward, and those kind of things. You know, I think there's good and bad in modernism, just as like there's good and bad in traditional housing, isn't there? I mean, isn't it all depending on our personal taste?
Am I?
Question, yes.
Okay, well, this is quite interesting. This statement, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and we're all different, because actually a great deal of tests have been done on that, and it turns out to be not the case at all. And what I find very interesting was a survey done quite a long time ago, which appears in a book called Mental Health and the Built Environment. And somebody got a large number of undergraduate students, and they showed them a series of pictures of people, and they were supposed to rate the people as attractive, don't care, unattractive, something like that. And what happened was that there was a huge correlation between who was attractive to look at, who was unattractive to look at, and who people didn't care about. So, I mean, I always like the comment by Joanne Woodward, who was married to the most beautiful man who ever lived, Paul Newman. And she said, somebody asked her what it was like, and she said, imagine wherever you go, every pair of eyes that belongs to a woman, and most of the men are just staring at the man standing next to you. So there's no, you know. So then they showed the students pictures of buildings. And there was a strong correlation of whether buildings they liked and disliked amongst all the students who weren't architects, and the architects all liked the opposite. So, I mean, there's loads and loads of tests done on all this stuff. Narcofin, which I guess you were alluding to, was quite a disaster, because there was never any communal living in there, really. People quickly partitioned off their areas and introduced things, and eventually the building fell into disuse. Somebody from a ministry took over the whole top floor, and I don't know what's happened to Narcofin now, but it was actually falling to pieces. And it's interesting, Le Corbusier took all the drawings of Narcofin away to sort of do his own stuff in France. And he eventually fell out with the architect of Narcofin, whose name I can't remember. And they both said each other were a hopeless architect. As for Zaha Hadid and so on, well, that's a whole nother lecture. I could give you that lecture you like, but
maybe. Matthew, you have a question or comment?
I mean, the real sort of thing about this, though, is who controls it, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, if you take, say, you know, the town I live in, Glasgow. I mean, you know, they after the war, of course, they decided to flatten half of it to run a motorway through it, despite the fact that, of course, very few people in the city actually owned cars at the time. They were going to build more motorway, and actually, if you look carefully and you know where it is, you can see all the spurs off the end in various places where there was supposed to be more motorway. And of course, obviously, they flattened all the old housing, which I mean, most of which was pretty vile and disgusting, and then built these enormous concrete towers all over the place, which of course were all owned by the council, and based on debt, of course. So of course, then naturally the government wouldn't allow the council to have enough money to actually maintain these things, you know. And of course, obviously, when you get a position, and the council, of course, owned, I mean, much of the housing stock of the city, and of course, then of course, what they've now done is to blow up all those towers, you know, which are all classically brutalist towers, in some cases quite interesting in those terms. And it depends. I mean, really, again, I mean, living in them is quite different. I mean, some people liked it, some people didn't, and it also depended on who they put in the towers, and where they were. You know, if you go in some towers, you know, the ones that remain, if you go in some of them, everybody's decorated the, you know, the communal spaces in the middle, and they're all clean stuff. You know, in other places, it's vile, because they, you know, obviously they, it's who they put in these places, and it's also the fact, as I say, that they wouldn't give, you know, they wouldn't allow enough resource to maintain the things. You also have, of course, the other thing is the number of buildings of significance in this city which are now at risk. There's a great list of them. You know, I mean, we have, say, things like the Egyptian Halls, which is one of the earliest iron frame buildings, been rotting in the middle of town for the last decades and decades. You know, the council has been desperately trying to get somebody to fix it. You know, and it's steadily decaying. It's a Greek Thompson building. It's, you know, it's an incredible piece of say, historically significant. And you can go through this list of these things, but they won't allow the resource to keep this heritage and built environment going. At the same, you know, you also have now what happened now, of course, is that they got rid of public control housing. They gave it to a housing association, which is essentially the banks. So of course they blow up all the towers and start building developing housing instead. So what you've got, of course, is both housing for profit, which is a disaster, and what you would call a process of social cleansing. I mean, you know, people are being cleaned out of. I mean, it's far worse in London, obviously. I mean, people are being literally expelled from London. You know, I mean, here you just people just being expelled from different areas of the city. You know, and so in those terms, again, as I say, it's about control. It's how do people have the ability to decide what gets built, who lives in it, what gets demolished, and how the actual environment looks, you know. And none of that, of course, is in the hands of the mass of the people at all. I mean, now, of course, I mean, the other thing is the planning department in the city is nakedly corrupt. You know, it was actually known that they're in receipt of brown envelopes, and therefore the city will tear up its own plan in order to allow developers to build what the hell they want. You know, and that's normal now. That's a normal method. You know, developers actually, I mean, will confess it. It's actually part of their expenses. Is actually handing over the brown envelopes so they can build what the hell they like, where they like. You know, it's as a social, you know, capitalism is social and concrete, if you like, for catastrophe.
I mean, that's a good point, isn't it? It should be up to people to have a say on these matters, how we live, and you know, if some people like modernist architecture, why not let them, you know, live in modernist buildings? But it's clearly not at the moment up to people, but it's about money, isn't it? And how many people you can squeeze into a big tower block, and certainly some modernist.
It also, of course, it goes beyond that. Also, is the role of government. And if you look at it, the most you know, the two of the major building projects in Scotland. One was the M74, the motorway in the middle of Glasgow. They spent £500 million on that. Now, if you said you've got £500 million to spend on Glasgow, about the last thing you'd want is a bloody motorway. You know, what do you want another damn motorway for? Plus, of course, they chucked it through a whole load of industrial waste. So, I mean, made the environment much worse and much more dangerous. I mean, the biggest reserves of chromium waste in the country basically are sitting underneath that as they put it through. You know, or in fact, the second bridge over the Forth, the second road bridge over the Forth. Again, I mean, entirely unnecessary, but obviously there's a relationship between the Scottish government and the people who did the building, and they said, well, you know, you lot can keep us happy and give us your money, and we'll keep you happy, and all the rest of it. And of course, the only people who don't get any say are the people who actually get to foot the bill.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything on that, Malcolm?
Well, I think much of what Matthew said sort of actually supports me. I mean, of course, the whole thing goes back to the form of governance we live under, which is a sort of ruling elite and a sort of sham democracy. People don't have any say in what gets built, really, at all. I mean, and the point about modernism is, I mean, you know, I don't want to talk about it, but the interesting thing about social housing was a mixture usually of low-level housing and tower blocks, and they never demolished, as far as I know, the low-level housing. They only ever demolished the tower blocks. Of course, it's ironic that in New York now they're building these things called skinny skyscrapers, where each floor is a flat. But of course, the people who live in those skinny skyscrapers don't live lives like most people do. I mean, they just go from private jets to, you know, that sort of life. I mean, it is a lot to do with consultation. I mean, the slide I showed at the end of called Architecture Without Architects. I mean, that most of those, if you look in those books, I mean, the Architecture Without Architects is readily available. The other two books are very obscure. But I don't know, I mean, if anybody wants to sort of send questions in or something, I can give all sorts of references. I mean, I think what Matthew was saying was really supporting what I say. I mean, I don't want to talk about, well, yeah, I mean, it's much to do with society. I mean, if you look at the Communist Manifesto, which is something I'm much in favor of, I mean, it actually outlines a sort of society that none of us live in. I mean, it's much more communal, much more, you know, much less hierarchical, well, not hierarchical. And of course, that's what people lived in for most of their life on the planet. So people would be happy with that. But I mean, for all sorts of reasons, which we all know, modern industrial life have sort of different wedges between all sorts of things. You know, to own a house. I mean, you know, I mean, one of the interesting things about hunter-gatherer society was it was called the no reward. I can't remember what it's actually called, but if you said to me, "Oh, I like your bow," I just give it to you. I mean, I don't expect you to give me something in return. I just give it to you. You know, people just give stuff away because it's easily obtained and not valuable. So you come up to me and say, "Oh, I like your car." I don't say, "I'll give it to you." Well, I might, but so I think, you know, I mean, never mind about modernism. I mean, modernism, I think, modernism, it didn't work in anything, actually. I mean, modern music, modern ballet, modern all the rest of it. I mean, it's very minority interest. I mean, I don't know how to play music on my PowerPoint, but I could play you some modern music, and nobody's going to buy that stuff. I mean, it's not, and that applies to everything, you know. I mean, you know, and you. I mean, one of the interesting things about art. I mean, there's a nice book called. My memory's gone in recent years. I'm sorry. It's called the Painted Word, also by Tom Moore, and it's about two art critics in New York are trying to find the most minimalist painting possible. And eventually one of them finds a painter who doesn't paint anything. He just puts canvases he bought from the shop on the wall, and everybody looks at it, sort of stroking their beard. Well, they've got one, so they go, "Oh, that's interesting. I think I see what he's getting at." Say, "Well, it's not he, it's she." Go, "Oh, yes, of course, yes." I see that. Don't know what to say. I mean, I couldn't talk about cars. I don't have any time. I mean, cars are a sort of disease in so many ways, and the world doesn't take it remotely seriously enough. I mean, I think cars are not awful things as such, but the way we've sort of welcomed them into our homes is awful. And obviously motorways going through cities, I mean, absolutely inhumane.
I think humanity and what we need should always be at the center of things, shouldn't it? It should be,
Yeah.
it should. And that's why I actually kind of like about the idea of Bauhaus, you know, most of them came from a kind of socialistic background, and they wanted to
Well,
buildings where form follows function, you know, where it makes sense.
Yeah, I'm
Not
sorry.
all about lots of money and rich outside, but you actually, you know, it fulfills a human need.
Well, the Bauhaus was again, you read in detail. I mean, it was very much a failure for lots of reasons, and you know, it's now being taken up. I mean, it's quite interesting that what the people there made things look as though they were industrial, and by people who had no idea how an industry made anything. So, you know, you've got your handcrafted industrial chair. And the most interesting about Bauhaus, well, I always like it, but it's not funny at all. One of the graduates was a man called Fritz Ertl, E-R-T-L. I don't know if you've heard of him. And he drew the drawings of the gas chambers in Auschwitz. And they tried, I mean, some people have written, oh, the concentration camps are the ultimate Bauhaus sort of buildings. But anyway, he's been put on trial several times because people think, you know, the person who drew the gas chambers at Auschwitz should be punished a bit. But they could never find any drawing of his where it actually said gas chamber on it, you see. And he just said, well, I just did shower rooms, and that's what they asked me for. And there they all are, you see, and I drew them, and that was it. I mean, and of course, most Bauhaus graduates sort of were German, and most of them lived in Nazi Germany, and most of them had to sort of like, you know, all have to live. I mean, so, I mean, I think the whole idea.
The Nazis persecuted Bauhaus architects. You know that quite a few of them ended up in Auschwitz. It was banned. So I don't think they were all Nazis. Not
like you, I've got a shelf load of books called modern art in Nazi Germany and all the rest of it. I mean, it's a very, very confusing subject. I mean, I even got 3 books which I can't understand, all called Fascism. And I've read all 3 of them, and I still don't know what they're talking about. I mean, yeah, I mean, what I want, I mean, from this talk is people to sort of start thinking about it and having thoughts about it, rather than just saying, well, that's that, and you know, because people don't have any say in the matter. They really don't, very unusually. And they're members of the ruling class, and the members of the ruling class go to an architect, and architects are these people that have been trained in this particular way. I mean, the person, my favorite Bauhaus person, is Hannes Itten, of course, who was completely mad. And he was the one who invented the force course, and he was the one who invented the brainwashing idea. I mean, his course at the beginning of the Bauhaus was, his idea was to cleanse the student's mind and empty them of anything they'd ever seen. And they had to make something, had to make an object as part of his classes, which was like nothing they'd ever seen in their life. Good. Other questions?
Yeah, we've got a few comrades with hands up. Virginia, please.
Yes, well, a couple of questions and a comment. My first question is, where do you place in your panoply of fascist modernists Bernard Rebetkin? You certainly wouldn't place him there, would you? Finsbury Health Center. Yeah.
Sorry, if you have another question, Virginia, shall we collect a few? Sorry.
In line with that, I don't know whether there was a film, a documentary made in 2010 by someone called Tom Cordell called Utopia London. And it's about sort of idealist architects. And I don't, being old too, I don't remember the name of a particular architect, but I think he, if I remember correctly, one of the architects that he covers in that film was a brutalist architect, but he actually had the extraordinary thing of living in one of the buildings that he designed, to his credit. The comment that I wanted to make, but I do want to know what you think of Bertold Lebedkin. But apart from that, I grew up in New York, and when I first came to London, I was surprised to find that, you know, people associated high rise, or even not quite high rise, but something in between, as being a terrible place to live. Whereas, you know, in New York, I mean, you have what you were describing as this sort of one floor for a flat and a skinny building. But, you know, you've had all sorts of buildings that are, you know, the building that I grew up in New York City was 6 stories, but a lot of people live in taller buildings in you know, the Upper West Side, or you know, their buildings are very functional, and they're not, you know, dreadful places of you know, some are, but you know, it's not so much obviously the nature of the building being several stories high, but what else all goes into it and who it's for, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not always for just the billionaires and the poor people. It's for a lot of people in between, although these days, who knows what that means, you know. But yeah, so yeah, going back to the first question, what do you think of Lebedkin and his work?
Well, I don't have any special regard for Lebedkin and his work. He did what were those towers, those flats in Hampstead that I went to dinner. I had a funny dinner party in one of them.
Finsbury Health Center.
Finsbury Health Center is full of, I mean, I don't know what it's like as a building. I don't think I've actually ever been there. I meant to go there lots of times. And it's supposed to, I mean, the thing is, it wasn't the building, it was the organization of the health center that was important. I mean, it was a central point for lots of services which were properly funded at the time. So it didn't really matter what the building was like, actually. I mean, it wasn't the building defining what the people did at the Finsbury Health Centre. What defined what people did in the Finsbury Health Centre was the local authorities, I don't know, the way the local authority dealt with it. I mean, they made a place where lots of things could happen. So you didn't have to go here and there and everywhere else, I suppose. I mean, a lot has been written about Finsbury Health Centre, but I mean, Lebedkin, I mean, he was, I think he was Lithuanian, in fact. Was he
Georgian, I think, wasn't he?
Sorry?
Maybe Georgian, I'm not sure.
Well, I don't know. He was Russian,
Yes, he was.
inverted commas.
Yeah.
And he actually worked for Le Corbusier, I think. I think he actually worked for him, put it on his list. And he came to England and he worked with something called the Mars Group. I mean, I'm now having to use my memory, which over recent years has suddenly gone downhill. But the Mars Group were a group of modern architects, and they built various things in the 30s. And I think he was a member of it. And an engineer called O. Varrick was also a member of it. And there was quite a funny discussion in the magazines when they were both old men about the penguin pool, because people might know what the penguin pool was in London Zoo, and it was a great work of modern art. And unfortunately, the penguins found it so awful to be in the penguin pool that they had to rotate them with Whipsnade Zoo and bring sort of fresh penguins back who hadn't been worn out by the penguin pool. And there was a big argument in the magazines about who did the engineering, and Lubetkin said, well, it was all my idea, and Arup was absolutely hopeless. And Arup wrote, well, of course, Lubetkin knew nothing about structures at all and was sort of half-wit. So I don't know. I mean, I don't have a view about Lubetkin, really. And about tall buildings in New York, I mean, I've never lived in New York, unfortunately. I think I would say 6 stories is about maximum for sort of humane places. I mean, it's about the maximum you can walk up when the lift's broken. And I don't know who likes traveling in lifts. I mean, that's one of those extreme non-places. You're talking to your friend and somebody else gets in, and suddenly everybody stands there humming to themselves.
Una, please.
Good evening to all of you and Happy New Year. Now, I know nothing about architecture. Therefore, Malcolm, thank you very much for enlightening me. Thank you for the flag which is behind you, secondly. And what are the female architecture? I'm fed up going to places where kitchens are always too small for us. I'm French, as you can gather with my accent. And why do you men build kitchen too small for us? Number one. Second question, I used to live in a lovely place in outside Oxford, small, beautiful, blah, blah. That's gone. We now have American Mall, outside town, ghastly places where you have to shop. Nothing is gone. Although my bakery is gone, my fishmonger is gone, my blah, blah, blah is gone. For what's going on? Thank you, Malcolm.
Yeah, well, first of all, don't say I don't know anything about architecture. You know huge amounts of things about architecture because you lived in a building, you were born in a building, I imagine, and brought up in the building, went to school in the building, university in the building, went to work in the building. I don't know, you walk past buildings, you go into buildings, you now have a huge knowledge of architecture. And it's only because people say, I'm an architect, and you go, well, I don't know anything about it. I mean, and certainly, there have been a few women architects, but I mean, on the courses, it's about 50-50. But coming out and crawling up the profession, of course, the women get pushed aside for all sorts of reasons. I mean, one of the reasons, I mean, I really don't want anybody to say I don't know anything about architecture. And if we've got time, I don't know what the time frame we're working in here, but I once went to a very interesting meeting at the Royal Institute. By the way, I'm not an architect, if anybody thought I was. They wanted to refurb a big council block, as we used to call them, in Finsbury. And they got some architects sort of appointed. And the architects were given the flat on the whole thing to be their office. And the first thing they got was a letter through their letterbox saying, there are architects in the building. Do not talk to them. Do not have anything to do with them. See, so the architects thought it was a bit strange. So eventually, I don't know how long the story was, they got on side with the people, and they refurbished the whole complex. And at the talk at the RIBA, the architect stood up in front of everybody to talk about the building. The first thing they said was, "You see on the front row of the hall, these people are the housing committee from the block of flats. They all live there." And he said, "What I can tell you, we learned more about architecture from these people than we ever did going to School of Architecture." So, I mean, people like you, for instance, you know a lot about architecture. You know about the size of kitchens. You just told us. And lots of other things. Lots of things.
Thank you. Glyn.
Thank you. Thank you, Malcolm. I enjoyed the historical discourse, and
You've muted yourself, comrade. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Okay. I do think that form, I would follow Sullivan and say form does necessarily follow function, taking a natural perspective. I have a question, though, which you may, what is it, a position perhaps you may agree with or not. Sorry, I'm slipping. That just because something is technically possible, does it mean to say it's desirable? And that's a real question I have in terms of art and architecture. But it's also a question, I would say, just because capitalists needed people to come to a place of work in the city, they took people from the rural areas and put them into absolutely awful housing. In fact, the picture you showed of the inner London architecture was perhaps occupied by more than 2, 3 or 4 families. It was not a house as you'd showed before. In the northwest of England, where I spent many years, there were still back-to-back houses in the 1970s and 80s, and people did have them as single houses. But in their history, in the Victorian period, and prior to that, they were occupied by several families, not just one. So the form follows function, if you agree with that. Is it necessarily the case that just because something's possible technically, it's desirable? And I do love the female architect's design that Tina mentioned earlier. The curvy shape, I think that is a brilliant piece of art as well as functional building. And my last point is that I live currently in Prague, where there is some of the most beautiful Austro-Hungarian architecture. During the Soviet socialist republics, the blocks of flats or the housing there in the city was occupied, and still today is occupied, by people from different professions. So you can go from architect to street cleaner in the same block. They're your neighbours. And I thought that's very interesting that I'd not come across that in any other city. And the last point, where would you rather be in, I think I know the answer to this one, in a building designed by an architect of the Bauhaus or one designed by Gaudi, as in Barcelona?
Well, think about the back-to-back housing was or is when they knocked it all down in vast areas and decanted the people, as it's called, as though they were coffee or something. I mean, the construction may not have been that good, but certainly they could have been refurbished and redone in ways so that the whole thing wasn't just destroyed and so on. I mean, but the whole idea was, as Ezra Pound said, make it new, sold, knock it down, we don't want it. I mean, one of the things I think is a point I made, which I found interesting, and I checked it in several books, is you won't find a guidebook that has a picture of almost never. You find a picture of any building built after the Second World War, when modern architects, so-called, got in control. I mean, Gaudi, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what I'd rather live in neither of them, actually. I mean, Gaudi makes me feel slightly ill, I must say. I mean, I used to go, I used to teach structures in the School of Architecture for quite a long time, and they used to have outings to Barcelona. I went to Barcelona over and over again, and I mean, you could just walk up, just go on the building site and walk up the thing, and walk all over the place of that extraordinary and completely mad church. I mean, not being religious, I don't really understand any of it. I mean, it was quite interesting. He designed some flats, I can't remember what they're called now, very expensive. And then when he died, the lady who owned the flats took all his furniture out of her flat and threw it away. She didn't care to do while he was alive. I mean, form follows function. I don't go for that at all. Can you do it because it's possible? Of course not. So a complete waste of money, and unless there's some real point to it. I don't know. I mean, I've got time to deal with these things. I'm very sorry. You're asking.
So, Malcolm, what is the point of architecture then?
Of architects?
Yeah, but no, what is the point of architecture?
Well, I mean, we have chosen since about 9,000 years ago, which wasn't long ago. I mean, it is if you're a human, but I mean, if the species to live in buildings. And so one of the questions I asked myself, and I can't answer it, is what on earth do we as hunter-gatherers expect from architecture? Because there wasn't any. I've gone through a whole list of stuff of people do because they're hunter-gatherers. I mean, they like going camping. They like taking their clothes off in hot weather. They like having barbecues. They like, you get a whole list of things going. Oh yes, why do people like to? And I mean, there was a quite interesting essay or paper written, what's his name? Jared Diamond, 1968 or 9, and it was called Human's Biggest Mistake. And his biggest mistake was inventing farming, because he's got technical reasons in the paper, because immediately health of people suffered, and of course women became oppressed like they have been ever since. I mean, the fact that hunter-gatherer groups were non-hierarchical and egalitarian, I think, is established. I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, but I mean, I've read so many books about it that nobody seems to disagree with that point of view. So, I mean,
well, one could take hunter-gatherers that still exist as in some more remote areas, like the Mongols, whose design of their yurts is still as functional today as it was.
Yeah, but they're actually herders, which was stage after hunter-gathering. I mean, hunter-gatherers didn't have any animals, as far as I know. I mean, it was an anthropologist on the call, and that'd be interesting. I mean, really, I gave this talk because I wanted people to think about it and talk about it, and not. It
is appreciated, Malcolm. Thank you.
I mean, that's what I want people to do. I mean, and of course, we have no power. I mean, I'm an ordinary person like everybody here, I guess. I mean, I can't commission buildings, and so on. So as my last diagram, I mean, we're piggy in the middle, and we don't get a chance. It just, I mean, and the politicians don't. It's not raised as a political issue, and so politicians don't care about it. I mean, with exceptions. I mean, I'm very cynical, like everybody else, about official politicians who, as far as I can see, and most people can see, are mainly interested in their careers. And people I've known being close to them said, yes, that's what they're interested in. And so they're not, I mean, like Harold Wilson wanted to knock down half of Whitehall and lived in a sort of standard semi somewhere. I mean, he wasn't dying to have modern architecture. It's all very surreal.
I love Gaudi, but I don't necessarily have to live in the Gaudi cathedral. Like looking at it, maybe Harold Wilson felt the same.
Well, that's the real test, I think. I mean, when people say, you know, like you like Zaha did some whatever it is. I mean, we don't even know what it is. I mean, we think it's an opera house, I think, don't we?
It was a cultural center in Baku, the one you showed.
I think it's supposed to be an opera house. Yes, I mean, all this started with the Sydney Opera House, the sort of swirly. Well, it didn't actually. It started with a German architect called, oh God, Hinterwasser or something. He was completely mad, and he had sort of mad drawings in about 1920 or 23. Never got built. So you've got the Einstein Tower, of course, which is a bit swirly. Eric Mendelsohn. That's supposed to be made out of concrete, but in fact it was made out of bricks and covered over with cement, so it looked like concrete. Yeah, I mean, when somebody say, "Oh, I like that building," I always say, "Well, how would you like to live in a town where all the buildings look like that?" I mean, I think that's the real test.
Well, it's not everything has to look the same. It's quite exciting when things look different, aren't they?
I suggest you, and everybody, in fact, looks at the book called Architecture Without Architects. I mean, it was actually, well, he's dead now, but it was a book of an exhibition curated by a man called Bernard Rudolfsky, I think was either an Austrian or German architect who went to America, like everybody else. And he produced this exhibition, which became a book. And I mean, it's a very interesting book. And you know, I mean, you'll see all sorts of stuff in there. I mean, it's still available from your library from Ireland.
Got one more question or comment from Mia, who can't switch on her camera, but you can speak.
Okay.
Yeah. Regarding what was said about the motorways and cars, I do think more public transport would be a good thing in light of there are fewer cars, but I drive a lot more because I feel safer driving. And for me, especially around big cities, I feel quite uneasy around the authoritarianism in recent years and police powers. And I'm an autistic trans woman of color and have been subjected to a lot of abuse. And the sort of powers the police have these days with things like stop and search and things like since this quote unquote war on terror, I've never really felt safe. And I think addressing a lot of these social issues would sort of help encourage a lot of people to use public transport more. And I think a lot more. I've never liked punitive ways of addressing the issue, like road pricing or like penalizing motorists, because I think a lot of them, like myself, would use public transport if it was more accessible to them. And I think public transport is inaccessible to a lot of people for a number of reasons. And I think I know even Natalie Bennett from the Green Party once said, it's not about changing people's behavior. It's about making the greenest option the easiest option so people would automatically use it. And I think more needs to be done at making public transport more affordable and accessible and attractive to people so that they just want to use it.
Thanks, Mia. I mean, related to that, there's a question I was going to ask you towards the end, Malcolm, is the idea of building houses. You know, I mean, the main issue should be, does it help us, doesn't it? It should be for us, for human beings. It should serve our purpose, what we need. And I do like the way you introduced this session about, you know, we come from very egalitarian societies where about 150, 200 people lived together, shared everything, shared childcare, you know, as a mom. And it's a bummer. You're stuck in your own little house with your child. There's children over there, but they're all in their own little houses, you know. And buildings, everything should be designed to serve us, you know, how we want to live. And I do like the idea of, public transport is important, but what's also important is that we actually build communities where we work, we live, we shop, we play. We don't have to travel 2 hours to get to bloody work and back, but that we actually design things in a much more human way. We're not profit, not the company is at the heart of it, but us, our human needs, how we want to live and how we think we should live with nature, with greenery around us, rather than in, you can have a classical shit bit of architecture and you can have a modernist crap architecture. The point is, do they serve us and not the other way around?
Well, speaking to Mia, I'm very sorry to hear about your difficulties in life. As you can see, I'm a pale, middle to upper class English person, and so I'm luckily have never been subjected to any sort of discrimination in my whole life. So though I have people in my family who have for various reasons, I can only be sympathetic. I can't put myself in their position. I mean, you just can't. Yes, public transport. Oh, I couldn't. I mean, if I wanted to talk about cars and transport, that would be another hour or two, I guess. I mean, I'm very much in favour of public transport being free, and I'm very much against private car ownership, even though, of course, well, I don't actually own it. I have one. We have one. Yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, what I would. I mean, if that's the sort of final thing I would say. I mean, I think we should demand of our politicians, if we're still going to work in this system of having politicians, we can't move on from it, which would be nice. Could I just mention Rojava? I already mentioned Rojava. Maybe I have. I mean, Rojava. No, I shouldn't say. Yeah, I mean, I once was trying to convince the Labour Party when I was in it, local Labour Party, to be interested in all the stuff I'm talking about, and I produced something called Humane and Inhumane Architecture. I mean, I think modernism has got inhumanity built into it personally, but what we're all saying, we want to live in humane places. I mean, the lady who came on saying she can't go out the house and go to the fishmonger anymore or anything. I mean, yeah, I mean, everybody feels that, but that's not their choice. I mean, they're subject to capitalist forces, I guess, or ruling elites, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, I'm very critical of what people think they're living in democracies. I mean, nobody lives in a democracy as far as I know. I mean, I can't find one apart from Rojava, which I suppose you've all heard of. Yeah, Rojava. Anyone? No? Come on, Tina. No Rojava. Come on. Rojava is.
Explain it for people.
Okay, Rojava is also known as Autonomous Area of Northeast Syria. And if you Google Rojava, Rojava, you'll get loads of stuff. And what's very interesting about it, I mean, it's currently under a lot of threat, because when in the end of the Syria civil war, which the dictatorship didn't quite get back the whole of Syria, the Kurdish people in northeast Syria got themselves together and produced a society which, as far as I can make out, is amazing, because every single level there has to be equal men and women, including in the army. The women fire guns, they drive tanks, they get killed, and all the rest of it. I mean, it seems amazing. And they don't have any prime minister, they don't have leaders, they have people's assemblies, they have, so on. And I've only read about it, never been there. It's under threat. So I suggest to everybody here that they Google Rojava, Rojava, and it's really quite extraordinary. Don't know what their architecture is like.
Matthew put in the chat, and that I think he has a point, which I don't know about Rojava myself, but it does have the history of the Kurdish struggle is unfortunately a struggle that has been taken over often and instrumentalized by the Americans. So I am unsure if that is the case in the case.
Well,
unfortunately, that is often has happened with the Kurdish freedom struggle, that they have sided with.
Well, what happened with the Java, the Rojava, or the autonomous region, was because the Kurdish society they built is sectarian, and it's not mainly Kurds, but it's also other people there, and they all have exactly equal rights. Was they were very much against IS or ISIL or various names it had. And so they were completely opposed to this sort of very harsh form of Islam. So they were prepared to fight and die, these extremists. Well, and the Americans were very keen to help them. So they put an American base in their area, and they've got aircraft cover. So they don't need aircraft cover from ISIL, but they need it from the Turks, because the Turks hate the Kurds for reasons I can't understand. Getting started off the subject of architecture, and so currently it's very complicated. And I guess that Trump would just pull the whole on all of the Americans out of that, and the Turks will invade, or the Iranians will invade, and at the end of that.
Okay, we can't talk about Syria and architecture. That's getting too much, I'm afraid. But thank you very much for joining us, Malcolm. Thank you very much for
thank you,
the audience.
and thank everybody for asking questions. And it'd be nice to do something like this again one day.
We are, I just mentioned, we are starting a new series next week, which is called Building a Communist Party, Past Attempts and Future Prospects.
Interesting.
Quite excited about it. Yes, we're going to be looking at current issues. How would you build a communist party? How not to? It's probably also very important. And also concretely our history. The history of the Communist Party of Marx and Engels, looking at German social democracy, and of course the CPGB in Britain, the old official one, how it was founded and how it fell apart, and what lessons we can learn from it today. I'm very excited about that. We also want to continue the Communist Culture Club, I hope, at least once a month. So if comrades do have suggestions for issues they want to introduce, questions, please get in touch, info@ymarx.com, and I'll see you next Thursday. Thank you, Malcolm. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming.